All right, good morning. It is here right at 9:19 a.m. on Wednesday, June 12, 2024. I do hereby call this meeting of the Industrial Development Board Ad Hoc Committee to order. I feel a little lonely up here, but that's okay. We will keep it moving. First item on the agenda, I'm called to order. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Item number 2, public comment period. The Industrial Development Board holds a designated public comment period at each meeting. Members of the public in attendance may provide comments to the board or its committees during such designated time. Members of the public are allotted 2 minutes for public comment. No advance registration is required. Is there anyone here from the public wishing to speak today? All right, as there is no one wishing to speak, we will move to close the public comment period. Item number 3, approval of prior ad hoc meeting minutes, May 8th, 2024. Those will be postponed to a future meeting for approval. Moving on to item number 4, so honored personally and humbled to ask to have an honorable gentleman with us, a gentleman of Nashville, a fellow Hume Fall graduate as well.
Blue Knights?
Blue Knights, let's go. Matt Wilshire, Senior Vice President of Affordable Housing, Pathway Lending, and President of Community Development, Pathway Affordable Housing Corporation. Obviously, this board overall has done a lot of housing projects here over the last year. It's been a focus of this board. Certainly, there's also been some legislation that's recently been passed in the state. And so based on the feedback from our board members that they've given us about the importance of housing and wanting to know if this IDB can do more to tackle that issue, I thought none better than Matt Wilshire to come, not only for his current role, but obviously previous roles as Chief Development Officer at MDHA. And certainly I met Matt almost a decade ago, which is wild to think about, when he was in the mayor's office as director of ECD, and certainly executive director of this board. And I actually reached out to Matt when I was thinking about trying to become a member of this board, and he was very kind with his time to give me some background and answer some questions for somebody that really didn't know a whole lot about Industrial Development Board and the economic development. So with all that, I thought it just made perfect sense and great time to have you come talk to us, Matt. So I really appreciate you coming. I know you put together a presentation for us. So even for our board members that aren't here, this is obviously live streamed, and so it'll be on video and it'll be a great reference. So with that, I will turn it over to you, and we have, I would say, probably about 30 minutes or so. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and I'm sure the attendance here is reflective of me and not of you. So, but I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk about this. This is some state legislation, sort of spurred mainly by some legislation that was passed earlier this year in support from Mayor O'Connell and the administration, but really gives a tool to the city and to cities across Tennessee to start to address the tremendous challenge that many communities are facing with the disappearance of affordable housing in our communities. And this board would play a critical role in that, a central role in that, if in fact this is a tool that the city decides to pull out of its toolbox. So thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. And I did put together a presentation, happy to share that with members of your group directly or email it around to other folks as well. I'll walk through that. I'm not sure that folks will have it in front of them, but if they would like, please email me. It's my email address is matt.wiltshire, WILTSHIRE, at pathwaylending.org,
Okay.
and I can share that information. So I'll start with the problem that we're trying to address. Nashville has seen, as have communities across the country, the disappearance of what's called NOAH, naturally occurring affordable housing. This has happened not for nefarious reasons, but because the market is doing what the market does. And in particular, improving neighborhoods, developers, sometimes in-community developers, sometimes out-of-state developers, look down and see an apartment building where working-class Nashvillians are living and say, man, I could really do something with that. And so those many of those apartment communities have been acquired The investors will put in a couple of $1 million. Let's say they buy an apartment for $20 million for a 200-unit apartment community, spending about $100,000 per apartment in that apartment community. Invest a couple of $1 million in that to improve the landscaping and paint it and make it a little bit nicer. Sometimes replace some of the appliances. But then they raise the rents from what may be renting for $900 or $1,000 for a one-bedroom up to $1,400. And many of the residents in those apartment communities can't afford that new rent, and so they are displaced. And over time, as their leases expire, they move out, new folks move in. The owner of that apartment building says, aha, now I've increased revenue 50%. And they sell that apartment building that they bought for $20 million, invested a couple $1 million in, they sell it for $30 or $35 million. That's a great deal for their investors. It's pretty terrible for the folks who can no longer live there.
Sure.
And that is just the reality of market economics. And so that's the challenge that we see in Nashville and in communities across the state, across the country. And we have worked to develop a market rate solution to help address that. And the opportunity is if we can partner with the city to use this new tool that the state has created, then we can have an even deeper impact and an even more benefit to help working class Nashvillians live in improving neighborhoods so we don't just suburbanize poverty. I will quote the guy who's now our mayor and ran a super effective campaign. I don't know if it was the official tagline of Mayor O'Connell's campaign, but he said, "I want you to stay." And this is a tool to help people be able to stay in their housing as their neighborhood improves. And so we want to help do that. So that's the introduction. That's the overview. Walking through the presentation, let me...
And I'm going to ask you, why don't you sit right here?
Okay.
Nobody's here, so it might be right there.
Sure. Happy to do it.
Have you right there. Just thank you. Thank you.
You bet. With that context, let me first describe Pathway Lending, because Pathway Lending has been around for 25 years. This actually was founded in 1999. This is our 25th anniversary. Pathway Lending is a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution. It's a designation. The idea of CDFIs sort of came to life in the 1990s. And Pathway Lending is a nonprofit CDFI. Really, you can think of a CDFI just as a bank, but as opposed to Bank of America or Regions that gets its assets from depositors who deposit money in the bank, and then the bank takes that money and lends it out and makes money on those loans, they hope, and then pays the depositors some interest usually. Pathway Lending is a bank, a nonprofit bank, but instead of getting our money from depositors, we get our money from other banks who give essentially very low interest loans or even zero interest loans to Pathway. That's where we get our assets. And they do that to satisfy something called CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act. The federal government says, hey, look, we provide a system that allows capitalism to function, and one of our expectations is that banks do good things. And the banks in Nashville do great things, but among the ways that they fulfill their obligations under the CRA is they give money, loan money to entities like Pathway, and our job then is to serve underserved communities. That is our job. That is what we do, and that's what we've been doing now for 25 years. We make loans to small businesses, we make loans on energy efficiency, and we make loans on affordable housing. And Pathway's now grown to a $350 million asset entity through that process. And we have those are the three sort of lending segments. We have 3 or 4 target communities who we serve. Folks who live in businesses that are located in low and moderate income census tracts, LMI census tracts, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. The idea is there are communities that have sort of been proven to have a lack of access to capital, and we are providing capital to those folks. We lend at rates that are comparable to banks' rates. We're not a discounted lender. We still need to turn a profit to be self-sustaining, but our default rates, despite the fact that we are lending to communities who the banks won't lend to, our default rates are actually no higher than traditional banks. That's happened in part because we think good at lending, but mostly because we actually have a team of consultants, free consultants who are employed by Pathway, who, when we talk to a potential borrower and we say, can we see your cash flow statement? And they say, my what statement? We work with them to help create a business plan and create the cash flow statement. And so we've now grown, as I said, to a $350 million asset bank. The next 2 pages in the presentation I won't go through. There are details about the numbers of loans that we've done and who we've served. We have about 60 employees today, headquartered in Nashville, but with offices in Chattanooga and Knoxville and Memphis. There information on page 5 about specific lending to the affordable housing community. The bottom line is we've done about $90 million worth of loans to folks doing affordable housing. Again, primarily folks who don't have access to other capital. If you're a large developer, some of the folks who've come before this board, LDG, Josh Haston is on.
They've never come before us,
Yeah,
but I'm
but
familiar
he
with them. Yes,
serves
they do a lot
on.
of development.
They've
That's
got great access to capital, and
We have Dominium today.
Elmington. Those folks have access to capital, but emerging developers, someone who's maybe turned a couple of houses, but now is looking to do a quadplex or looking to do a smaller apartment community, we can serve those folks fairly well. And then in other cases, we provide lending to affordable housing.
And just something real quick on that, just because we had them at our last meeting. We had a member of the Urban League at our meeting last week to talk to us about the Amazon Real Estate Development Academy, because they had just graduated their first class. So I think those are the types of individuals, because those individuals have some experience to get into that program, but probably don't necessarily have the capital level of a Dominium or some of the other companies you mentioned. So it seems like those would be like your market, your fit right there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we work well with the Red Academy, and we actually have our own version of that we've had for a number of years, and there's a great team that's been doing that similar work for some time. And those are a lot of our loans are to folks either who have come through our own free development classes, or have come through the Red Academy or other sorts of things.
Okay.
Page 6 in your presentation describes that Pathway has actually been a great partner for Metro. In particular, there's an example. Metro received some significant funds during COVID-19, the pandemic, and had difficulty finding places to put that money to work. Called Pathway, and because of our existing relationships with so many businesses in Nashville, we were able to quickly deploy those. Live music venues, small businesses. We actually did about $12.7 million worth of grants in a very, very short time period. And I'll just refer you to the finance department, who can tell you about what their relationship was.
Sure.
But I claim no credit for that. I was neither at Metro nor at Pathway at the time, but my understanding that worked very well. Page 7 just details the $180 million worth of loans that Pathway's provided over the last 25 years to businesses in Nashville. So that's Pathway. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the detail, and I won't go through all these numbers, but it's data behind what you know, which is rents in the last 10 years have effectively doubled in Nashville, median rent. There have been many apartments that have sold, and the price per unit on those sales has gone from $79,000 a unit in 2013 to $226,000 a unit in 2023.
Got to charge a little bit more when you're paying more for the property.
That's right. When interest rates fall and rents rise, prices soar through the roof. Slide 10, and I hesitate to do this because I don't want to demonize anyone, but these are just 4 simple examples of what has been the data behind what I described earlier. Again, an apartment community was acquired, rents were $900. 2 or 3 years later, rents are $1,423. There's examples of that. You know it to be true. This is just saying, yes, here are some specific examples of where this has happened and the impact that it's had on housing in Nashville. And then 11 is really the slide that best sort of, again, provides the data behind what we all know to be true. This is the number of apartment units in Nashville at each of the American Community Survey census 2010, 14, 18, and 22, which is the most recent data available. How many of those apartment apartments rented for less than $500 a month, or $500 to $1,000, $1,000 to $1,500, and above $1,500. For those of you who don't have the presentation in front of you, the most dramatic number is from 2018 to 2022. That 4-year period, the number of apartments in Nashville that rented, the number of apartments in Nashville went from 126,000 to 150,000. So nice little growth, 20%-ish growth in the number of apartment units, but the number of units that rented for between $500 and $1,000 dropped from 38,000 to 15,000, cut by more than half in 4 years. That was the disappearance of housing that was affordable for working class Nashvillians. And overall, that number has dropped from 2010 to 2022, from 72,000 to 16,000. This is the problem that we're trying to solve. The disappearance of housing for reasons that are just because that's where the market will support. And again, it's not nefarious. No one's doing anything bad, but there are really bad outcomes for working class Nashvillians.
And Matt, I appreciate you putting this together because, we talk about the problem. I think everybody realizes it's a challenge, but when you look at the numbers like this, and what's really telling to me is I'm looking at this is also the greater than 1,500. So
Yeah.
you go back to 2010, like it was unheard of.
Yeah.
To pay over $1,500 in rent.
Right.
Now look at 2022. Went from 5,000, 12 years later, 70,000 units go for over 1,500. That's just status quo for some folks, but
That's right.
For those that can't afford it, this is clear. It's definitely disappearing.
Yep.
So
That's the data. All right, I want to move through this. I love this data. Happy to discuss this data in great detail, but folks are cost burdened. That's on 12. What is affordable today? Hannah knows this very well. She lives this every day, but this is just sort of the math. Affordable housing means different things to different people, but this just is the math. Area median income for a family of 4 is about $100,000 a year, so that's easy math. It depends on where you are in AMI, what you can afford to pay in rent, and then what fair market rent is, which is the number effectively that MDHA will pay for a Section 8 voucher for a efficiency, a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, etc. So that data is here just to set the table. And then the last slide really takes from the Mayor Cooper's Affordable Housing Task Force that came out in 2021 to provide some data. The short version of this is we have to preserve what we have because it's just so expensive to build, and low-income housing tax credits are great at that and have made a huge impact in Nashville, but you just can't build enough fast enough because the quicksand is taking, there's too much going away. And so we need to both try and accelerate the construction to meet the demand, but also hold on to what we got. All right. I probably could have just said those words and everyone would say, yeah, we agree. You can skip all the data. But there's a mountain of data here supporting mathematically this premise. So that is then where Pathway Affordable Housing Corporation comes from. So I described Pathway. This is an effort that Pathway has created. You are meeting with the entirety of the Pathway Affordable Housing Corporation team right now. We are a subsidiary, a nonprofit subsidiary within Pathway that is looking to go do what those market rate developers do, which is to acquire apartment buildings that are at risk of becoming gentrified. Either they're in already improved opportunity neighborhoods or are in the pathway of gentrification, particularly along transit corridors. And so for anyone watching this, if you have an apartment building that meets that rough criteria, and we have, unlike a lot of the programs, LIHTC, that have very strict regulations about sort of what rents can be, we actually have a little bit more flexibility. And that's one of the beauties of where we are, the kinds of apartment communities that we can acquire. We can go acquire something that may not be strictly affordable to someone who's making 80% of AMI today, but we can hold rents flat, and I'll describe why in a moment, and so that over time AMI surpasses where our rents are, and so it becomes then affordable. We've got some flexibility in how we can structure it.
Okay.
Page 16 really just describes what I just said, which is there's Pathway as an entity, We are a subsidiary, Pathway Affordable Housing Corporation, and then we're going to go do what apartment developers do, buy apartments. And each one of those will be independently capitalized in its own LLC. We'll get debt either from banks or from other sources, Freddie or Fannie or the CDFI bond fund. This is the bottom line on Pathway. There are three things that are happening. We're going to acquire apartment communities, we're going to finance those acquisitions, and we're going to operate those assets. We hope to do the acquisitions and the operations as world-class standards. I'm not going to sit here today and tell you I'm going to be better at it than folks who've been doing this for 100 years, or there are many great Freeman Webb, LDG, Dominium. There are great apartment operators out there. I hope to be as good of them and maybe even better. But I'm not going to say that I'm going to be better than folks who've been doing this for much time. But I can tell you this. I'm going to have better financing than anyone else in the marketplace today. And that's just fact. That is our competitive advantage as Pathway, and it allows us to do things that the market simply cannot do. And that's what we'll get into some more detail on. So why can we do that? How can we do that? It's what I described earlier. Banks are required under CRA to do good things. Pathway has been doing good things for 25 years. We've got a track record. You can trust us. We've worked with Metro. We've demonstrated that. But what Pathway Affordable Housing Corporation can do is go get capital that is cheaper than anyone else's capital in the country. And that's just the structure that we have. Specifically, and let me go, page 18 describes the type of community. I've really already described it that we would be interested in acquiring, but really it's affordable apartments in the pathway of gentrification or that have already gentrified. Slide 19, as great as this idea is, I'm just copying a model that's already been really successful. The Housing Impact Fund in Charlotte is an innovative model that really proved that this can be done. Unlike Nashville, the city of Charlotte, over the last decade, has issued affordable housing bonds. As a bit of a side note here, they actually have to have all their bonds authorized through a referendum, which is crazy. So like every 2 years, they have a referendum on, can we issue $100 million of bonds to go build schools, or $50 million of bonds to go pave streets? That is a crazy thing. Bob Mendez and his colleagues, former colleagues on the Metro Council, have the ability to do that without going to referendum. And so, as you know, every year there's typically a capital spending plan where the city says, hey, we're going to issue, once we actually spend the money, we're going to issue $300 million worth of bonds to pave streets, build schools, buy parkland, build sidewalks. Anything that has a life that lasts longer than 4 years comes out of, I think it's 4 years, comes out of capital spending and is paid for with bonds as opposed to an annual appropriation. And so Charlotte has been doing that, and they've actually done 11 bond issuances over since 2002, issuing $260 million. The last 3 of those in 2018, 2020, and 2022 were for $50 million each. The city got that money. They've done a variety of things with it, supported folks like Rebuilding Together Nashville, the Charlotte version of that helps low-income seniors stay in their homes through weatherization. They've done gap financing on LIHTC deals, sort of like what LDG does, things to incentivize more LIHTC developers to do more deals. There may be a gap in their financing. They've provided financing to help those deals. But what they've also done that's quite innovative is the city of Charlotte will provide low-interest loans, 20-year loans, interest-only loans to developers it's not developers, but property owners who will do what I described, which is comply with a structure to make rents affordable. They have a whole criteria that they've developed about it needs to be on transit, or it needs to have environmental regulations, or it needs to have whatever it is that there are stipulations that Charlotte has created, but they will make these 20-year interest-only, low-interest loans. There's a group called Ascent Housing that worked with this model and has now gone out and raised two funds. The first one in 2020 of about $58 million, the next in 2023 of $67 million. So they've raised $125 million of equity, private capital from foundations and banks and corporations and wealthy individuals who get a below market return and in exchange do something good that has a return. It has a 6 to 8% return, sure. So higher than what I'm talking about doing, but they've been able to do this, and then they can't do pilots like we can, but they've sort of engineered a pseudo pilot where they pay property taxes, they then get about half of those property taxes back, and they use that grant funding to buy down the rents for about 20% of the units so that the rents are affordable to folks making 20 to 30% of AMI. And so they're able to serve people making 80 and making 30% of AMI, and that is really the model that we're emulating, with the idea being that the 60% of AMI working class Nashvillians are well served. We need more. We need more. But that market's being served by LIHTC. But folks making a little too much are not allowed to live in those units.
They're kind of in that donut hole.
They're in that donut hole. Yeah. And folks who make less than that, 40%, 30%, 20%, can't afford the rents that LIHTC developers have. And so those folks are really underserved in the Nashville of today, and that's who we're looking to serve. You don't have to take my word for it. There's great press about how successful the Housing Impact Fund has been, including, and again, I would encourage you to go listen to the podcast, You Might Be Right, that Governors Haslam and Bredesen have. I think it was October of 22, October 5th, if I remember correctly, of 22, they had Erskine Bowles, who was one of Bill Clinton's chief of staff. He's been a very successful investment banker and investor in Charlotte. Erskine, I say Erskine, I don't know the guy, but his first name's Erskine. That's pretty memorable. Got behind this effort that Mark Etheridge and the team at Ascent Housing did, and he was sort of, he and this guy Nelson Schwab were the impetus to help them raise funds, and Governors Haslam and Bredesen interviewed him in a really revealing and informative podcast.
Okay.
So you can go listen to that, hear more about it. All right, so, and we're getting to the crux. I hope I'm okay on time here.
You're good. You're fine.
Okay, I got about 5 more minutes here.
Yeah, we're good.
We've talked about the problem. We've talked about what they've done in Charlotte. Does that apply to Nashville? Is Nashville fundamentally different from Charlotte? There may be reasons that something works in Charlotte, doesn't work in Nashville. Well, the data are actually incredibly interesting. Slide 21 demonstrates that the median rents are almost identical, $1,394 in Nashville, $1,413 in Charlotte. Area median income for 4 persons in 2023, $99,812 in Nashville, $99,678 in Charlotte. I mean, it's identical. Home ownership rates are similar, mortgage rates are similar, cap rates are similar. These markets are very similar. They have a much better transit system. Encourage folks to support the transit referendum.
Here we go.
Hopefully we can catch up to them. We're working on that. Mayor O'Connell's going to make that happen this year. But those markets are very similar. There are a couple of things where Nashville is actually much better positioned. One is pilots. You guys can do pilots much easier. It's just very hard to do it in North Carolina. And second, we have this community investment tax credit, which is a state tax grant that they don't have in Charlotte, that allows Pathway and others to have access to even cheaper capital, and we'll get to that in a second. There was one advantage that Charlotte had that Nashville did not have. That lending that Charlotte is doing was not allowed under state law. But earlier this year, Senator Oliver and Representative Hemmer, with support from Mayor O'Connell, were able to get some legislation passed through the state legislature that said, essentially, that thing that they do in Charlotte that y'all can't do, you can do it now. And so that is now allowed under state law. Passed this year, overwhelming bipartisan majority, really an example of the state legislature working in a great way to address an issue that's existing state certainly in Nashville, but it's a statewide issue.
Sure.
I mean, hell, Jackson, with the Blue Oval development, has a massive influx of need for housing, and it's overwhelming that market. That market, Sevier County, Gatlinburg, those guys, Tri-Cities, Knoxville, Chattanooga, it's a statewide issue, and this law applies statewide. But as former council member Mendez can tell you in great detail, the city is under state constitution not allowed to issue bonds to support private development, but there are workarounds that we have. We've issued bonds to support private development, the new football stadium. How do we do that? In this case, it was not the IDB that issued bonds, it was the Sports Authority. So it's not the city issuing, there's a conduit issuing entity. And second, none of the repayment of those bonds can come from property taxes. It's just not allowed. And so the workaround is there has to be another mechanism, essentially with non-property tax revenues.
Revenue.
In the
Okay.
case of the Sports Authority, for the football stadium, it's the 1% increase in the hotel motel tax, as you know, and then sales taxes collected on that campus. I think those are the two repayment mechanisms. And there may be some other non-tax revenues, but that's how they did it. So what the state said is, hey, Nashville and other communities, you can do that to support affordable housing, just like you can for sports. And this is the opportunity that the city now has. With all of that background, I mean, you gave a former politician, the microphone. That's a dangerous thing. But we're now
You just let them go.
we're now to the opportunity that's in front of the city, and so the city of Nashville can choose. How this would happen specifically is the administration and the council would need to say, either through the issuance or the authorizing the IDB itself to issue bonds, or they could today and could have a year ago or 2 years ago said, hey, IDB, here's $5 million, $10 million of operating funds.
Sure.
That was allowed previously. You guys can go make these kinds of loans, but what the council will need to do is exactly what they did for the LIHTC pilots that MDHA administers. They would need to say, here is the framework under which the IDB is allowed to make these decisions.
Okay.
You guys can make the decisions, but it needs to be for projects where no rent is unaffordable to folks making more than 80% of AMI, or at least half of the folks make less than 80% of AMI, or it's got to be within 500 feet of a transit corridor, or it needs to have at least these environmental standards, or it needs to engage with Metro Social Services. Whatever the council and the administration deem are the qualifiers that make it a deal worth investing in, this is the framework. And then they would give that authority to the Industrial Development Board. The Industrial Development Board then would either, under old legislation, spend the money appropriated by the council, $5 million, whatever the number is, or, and this is the key, this is the part now that is now allowed, that was not previously allowed, the city could say to the IDB, you can issue, pick a number, $30 million worth of affordable housing bonds. But as you know, the IDB has no way to repay those bonds. There is no repayment mechanism. So no investors would buy those bonds because there'd be no way for them to be repaid. What the city can now do is say, hey, we as the city, because we see these things that you're going to do as really good investments
Sure.
for the city, preserving affordable housing is a good thing, just like having a police force is a good thing. We, the city, will back these bonds, and we'll back them with revenues other than property tax revenues. So I'm going to give an example here, just to the math is sometimes helpful. Let's say it was $10 million worth of bonds, just to make the math easy. Someone can check me on this, but generally, if a city is issuing bonds, the principal and interest on the repayment of those bonds is about 7% of the total value. So over 20 years, if you issue $10 million worth of bonds, you need to pay $700,000 a year. That would be $14 million over 20 years. Is that about the right number now? Maybe it's 7.5%, maybe it's 8% in the current interest rate environment. I don't know, but let's just say it's 7%.
Sure.
It doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter. It matters a lot, but for math purposes, hey IDB, you guys can go issue $10 million worth of bonds. We, the city, we got your back. We will cover the cost of those bonds up to $700,000 a year. The IDB issues the bonds. They get a 4.5% interest rate or 5% interest rate, which means that they got to pay $700,000 a year for 20 years. There's a $700,000 expense. You all then loan the money out to folks like me. There would be a competitive process, presumably. There would be some mechanism to do that. They've got to comply with the matrix that the council set up. And let's say that it's a 2% interest-only loan for 20 years, then I'm going to be paying you $200,000 a year. Mm-hmm. Now, the city, when it authorized you to do this, could either say, hey, IDB, you keep the money, and then you can use it to make other loans.
Do more stuff.
Or they could say, our city piece is only whatever you don't generate. And that is just a financial decision for the city to make.
Sure.
So in this example that I just gave, let's say that the city says, nope, you know, whatever you get, we'll cover the rest, but you got to cover that. In this example, $700,000 comes due. You got $200,000 from me. You got $500,000 from the city. That's the $700,000. Now there's a little bit of a weird thing here, right? Which is, in 20 years, I got to pay you all $10 million back. I or the other folks.
Only. Right.
Because it's interest only, but there's a bullet payment. So in year 20, you're not going to get $200,000 from me. You're going to get $10 million from me because I got to pay it back. And then the question is, does that money go back to the city? Does the IDB use that to make a new loan? How does this work? All of these are the specifics that need to be worked out. And it's just a financial decision that the city can make with the IDB about how they want to do this. In Charlotte, I will say, the idea is that these loans will roll over in the future. They don't have to be.
Sure.
The money can go back to the city or can stay in the IDB. Again, that's just a decision that needs to be made. It's essentially a decision. Does the city say, hey, we want to help a little bit? Or does the city say, we're going to do this to create an evergreen fund to do these sorts of things into the future? And that is a decision that the city can make and then the city can change. But that's the tool that exists. And the last piece, and then I'll stop.
You're
the
fine.
last piece that I have is what I hope would happen is that whoever you lend money to, you're essentially lending money to allow the affordable stuff to keep staying affordable. But what I would like is for the city to say, and in addition to that, we authorize the IDB to do a property tax abatement up to 50% of the property taxes, or whatever number it is. And whatever dollar for dollar reduction in property taxes results in a dollar for dollar reduction in some number of units, so that it's affordable to folks who make 30% of AMI. Again, like, keeping units around that are affordable in good neighborhoods to folks making 80% of AMI is interesting, is good, is important. I think it's helpful. I think it's vital to reduce displacement and to have a mixed income community
Sure.
where we don't suburbanize and concentrate poverty.
Sure.
But I think it's really interesting if folks living in Green Hills can afford to live in Green Hills and work at Trader Joe's, work at the hospitality there, and their kids can walk to Hillsborough High School. I think that's really interesting. And so what I would suggest is that this effort should say, for some or all or certain of the deals, we'll give a property tax abatement to make the math work for folks making 20% of AMI. And again, that's described a little bit. We can get into the math. The last slide, I think, after discussing all of that, is the sort of proof of the pudding. And this is why Pathway or other folks like Pathway on site 23, in a typical acquisition that we described earlier, there may be three pieces of capital: the senior debt, the mezz debt, and the equity. And a typical market rate developer, and if there's a market rate developer out here, you can challenge me if these numbers are off one way or the other, but 60% of the cost of that acquisition, again, that $20 million acquisition, 60% of the cost is probably gonna come from a senior mortgage. Today's interest rate environment, that may be 7%, maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's a little bit less, but that's a market rate 7% for 60% of the deal. The next 15% of the deal may be mezzanine debt. That's more expensive. It's debt, but that's 12 to 16% interest. And then the last 25% is equity, and those equity investors expect an 18 to 25% return on their money. That's risky capital. They're putting
You're going higher return.
higher return. It's equity. That's not secured in any way. So that blended cost of capital of that capital stack, and again, happy to do the math with you, but that blended cost of capital is 11.675%. So they need to generate annual returns to satisfy the debt, to pay the mezz, to give the equity investors their expected return, roughly 11 to 12% annual returns every year to keep up. Pathway Housing, we can get our senior debt a little bit cheaper because we're affordable. So let's call that 6.5%. I hope to do a little bit better, but let's call it 6.5%. I'm looking for mezz from the city at 0 to 2%. By the way, Amazon announced yesterday that they're going to renew the Affordable Housing Fund. Maybe there's a source of capital there. That's another $1.4 billion for another 14,000 units in Nashville, Washington, and Seattle. Certainly hope that may be a piece of mezz.
Sure.
Maybe it's going to be more like 3 or 4%. I've done a deal with Amazon, so I know what that paper looks like. But regardless, I want some mezz that's cheap. And then the equity, I described what they've got in Charlotte, which is 6 to 8% return equity in Charlotte. I think Pathway, because of who we are and the CITC, we can actually get equity even cheaper, like 2 or 3% equity. And that's what we're talking to our potential investors about providing to us. It really works out to sort of the same place because of that 5% CITC return for the bank. If we give them a 3% return on a dividend and then they get the 5% CITC break, they're at an 8% blended cost of capital, blended return. And they've got CRA credit, so they ought to love that. Banks out there, you ought to love that. But my then cost of capital is about 5%. And that's it. That's why I can go buy that same apartment building that you could buy, but you're gonna have to raise rents like this, and I can raise rents like this, and make it work. That's the whole story. Okay, I'll stop.
Well, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
guys.
So
Super interesting. I love it.
awesome.
And I'm so excited. This could be a massive thing for Nashville.
Absolutely.
It's a tool. It's a tool. But I think it can be massive for Nashville, massive for our state, to create a more equitable society, and to honor the work of the guy who I heard from most Sundays, Bill Barnes, to create mixed income communities where folks are living in proximity to each other.
Yep, just like Envision Casey over in East Nashville.
Amen.
So we're a little over. That's okay. So, quick question. First of all, thank you so much. This was perfect timing. Obviously, I really appreciate you, and I'm sure my fellow board members will as well appreciate the numbers you put together to back it up. Obviously, as I've shared with you and talking with you prior to the meeting, this board has not necessarily traditionally done tons of housing. Traditionally, obviously I've been on the board for almost 9 years now, but certainly over the last couple of years, this board has said, hey, we want to do more. They made it clear to me as their chair. And certainly this year, we've done quite a few housing projects. We have one on the agenda today. So I guess what I would say, this sounds all great. It's great that we have this legislation in place. That's step one. But and I'm asking this based on your unique experience as well as serving, as executive director of our board as well. What are some tangible next steps that you think as a board we should be taking to try to move this forward? Because obviously it'll take time to set up, but we need housing now. We're already behind, so we need housing now. So what are some tangible steps that you would recommend to me? I'm putting you on the spot, but
Yeah.
You're a politician, so you're used to
I
it.
want to be super respectful. Obviously, I'm working on this. I agreed to do this.
Sure.
The next step is really for the council and for the mayor's office. And they have a ton of stuff they have to do.
Sure.
There are schools that need to be built. There is a finite amount of debt capacity that this city has. And with all respect to that, that is just true. The city
Sure.
can't just go issuing debt. But that is the next decision. The transit is the next thing, but at some point, what I would love to see happen is the city make some sort of modest appropriation, either in bonds or through extra ARP funds that come back or whatever comes back. But let's give this thing a test run. Like, I think it works. It seems like it works. Like, it's working in Charlotte.
Sure.
But like, let's do a loan or two on a deal and then see if it's a thing that the city wants to do or not. Or, hey, it was good, but like, really, you didn't do this, and for the next one, we want to do that. Like, that's the next step. The city, the council, the mayor's office needs to decide when it is appropriate for them in the context of all the other things
Sure.
going on.
There's a lot going on.
Police, fire, transit, East Bank development,
Sure.
Hickory Hill Mall. There's a lot going on, but at some point, there needs to be dollars. And when those dollars come, the only place they can do this with these dollars is the IDB. You are the entity. It is you. If they want to use this tool, if they want to pull this tool out of the toolbox, they're going to hand it to you and they're going to say, go hammer some stuff. And so that's the next thing that needs to happen.
Understood.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And again, I'm glad that we've got this on video. And we'll put this on our website, the IDB website, this
Great.
presentation, so anybody can just go to the meeting link and take a look at it. And again, really appreciate your time today. This
Thank
was
you.
just phenomenal. And I'm going to ask you, so in the future, can we have you back on this?
Whenever you want me.
Okay,
And
all right.
You are my. I gotta woo you. So I'll come here anytime you want.
Well, welcome home. This is a
Thank
homecoming
you.
for you to an extent, so really appreciate it.
All right, it is here right about 10:04 a.m. I will go ahead and move to adjourn this meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee of the Industrial Development Board. I want to thank, obviously, our distinguished guest, Matt Wilshire, for his timely presentation and just perfect timing and really thought-provoking on this, so really appreciate Matt. I want to thank all of our guests that attended today. Also want to thank Metro Legal, the Metro Economic Development team for putting everything together for the meeting. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.